cast out by her entire town and left with absolutely nothing. A desperate young woman followed a forgotten map up a treacherous mountain trail. The cruel locals laughed, fully expecting the deadly wilderness to claim her life. They had no idea she was about to unearth a legendary, perfectly preserved ghost camp, hiding a massive, decades-old mystery. And they never suspected her staggering discovery would expose their darkest lies and completely rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in. Let us know where you're watching from. Ride slow with her a while. The wagon road up to Fox Ridge had not been a road in a long time. It was a suggestion, a memory of ruts under new grass, a place where the pines opened just enough for a horse to pass single file. Alice came up it in the last hour of light, the way she came up most things now, alone, thin-shouldered under a coat 2 sizes too large, reins loose across her palm, her mare's breath climbing white into the cold. She had left the town of Fox Ridge behind at dawn. She did not expect to see it again for a week, and she did not much care if she saw it at all. 3 months. That was how long since the fever had taken her father, and with him the small lease on the creek-bottom pasture that had been the only home Alice had ever known. 3 months since the note came due, and the man who held it, round, pink, contemptuous, had explained to her in the front room, where her father's body had lain, that a girl of her age had no standing to sign a renewal. 3 months since she had packed what fit in 2 saddlebags and led the mare out the gate for the last time, past the neighbors who had already begun to look through her as though she were weather passing. She had slept in a livery loft for 6 weeks. She had washed dishes at the Plank Hotel for board. She had listened because listening cost nothing. And one night in the kitchen, a freighter passing through from the eastern camps had spoken of the lost train. 6 wagons, 18 souls, gone up the old Ridge Road in the spring of '68 and never come down. He had laughed when he said it, the way men laugh at things that frighten them. Alice had not laughed. She had asked him where. The mare picked her way over a shelf of frost-cracked stone. Alice let her choose. The horse was old, 16 at least, a bay with a white star gone yellow at the edges, and she had been her father's before she was Alice's, and she carried a kind of patience Alice had come to lean on, the way other people leaned on prayer. The wind off the ridge smelled of pine sap and old snow. Somewhere below, a jay called once and was answered by nothing. By full dark, she made camp under a leaning cedar and did not light a fire. She ate cold biscuit. She listened to the mare crop moss. Above her, the stars came out hard and clean, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had nothing left the world could take, and that the thought ought to have frightened her more than it did. She reached the meadow the next afternoon. It opened without warning, the trees thinning, the ground leveling, and then a long, shallow bowl of grass laid out under the sky, ringed by dark timber, still as a held breath, and in the middle of it, 6 shapes. Alice drew the mare up and did not dismount for a long moment. She had half expected the freighter's story to be a story. She had half expected splinters, bones, a scatter of iron. What she saw instead was 6 covered wagons standing in a rough half-circle. Canvases sagged and grey, but still stretched over the boughs, tongues resting in the grass as though the oxen had only just been unhooked. She swung down slow. The mare did not follow at first. The mare stood with her ears forward and her nostrils working. and Alice laid a hand on her neck and waited. And after a while, the horse stepped after her. The way a horse steps into water, she does not trust. The first wagon was a plain box with iron-strapped wheels. The canvas had a long tear near the front bow, and through it, Alice could see, in the slant of afternoon light, the shapes of things a family carries. A flour barrel, a cast-iron pot lashed to a rib, a folded quilt faded to the color of dust, but still folded, still stacked, still waiting. A child's wooden horse tipped on its side atop a crate. Alice stood with her hand on the sideboard and felt something in her chest tighten and go quiet at once. She walked the circle. She did not touch anything. Every wagon was the same. Boxes packed, ropes still knotted, a tin coffee pot set up right on a driver's seat, as though someone had put it there to keep it from spilling and had turned to answer a call. In one bed, a pair of small leather shoes stood side by side, laces tied, waiting for feet. In another, an open Bible lay face down on a folded shawl, the pages yellowed but uncurled, sheltered from 20 winters by nothing but canvas and grace. No bones, no blood, no sign of any human thing at all. Only the wagons and what was in them, as though the 18 souls had stepped out of the meadow together between one breath and the next, and simply not come back. Alice sat down in the grass. The mare came and stood over her and lowered her head, and Alice put her forehead against the mare's jaw and stayed there until the light began to change. What kind of disaster leaves the pots still hanging and the quilts still folded? What kind of people walk away from everything they own and never return for it? And why, of all the souls in Fox Ridge, had this meadow waited 20 years for a disowned girl with nothing to lose? If you have ever wondered what silence in a wild place truly sounds like, stay with her. Leave a word below and tell us where you're listening from. And if this story has hold of you already, follow along so the next chapter finds you. Because what Alice Gray was about to unpack from those wagons, one careful crate at a time, would change the map of that valley forever. The light changed, and with it came memory. The way high country will pull a person's mind backward when the body has nothing left to do but sit. Alice stayed with her forehead against the mare's jaw and let Fox Ridge come up out of the grass around her. She saw the plank hotel kitchen with its low ceiling and the yellow lamp above the wash basin. She saw the freighter with his sunburned neck and the tin cup in his hand. And she saw the faces at the long table when she had asked, plainly and without dropping her voice, where the old ridge road began. A silence had opened around the question. Then the laughter, low and passed hand to hand like a coin. A drover snorted into his coffee. A woman with flour on her sleeve said loud enough to carry that the ridge road ate its own. Someone else said the girl had lost her father and her sense in the same season. The round pink man who held her father's note had been at the far end of the table. He had turned in his chair and looked at her the way a man looks at a lame calf. "Going up alone," he said. "I am," Alice answered. He smiled without warmth. "Then go." He laughed once, a short, flat sound, and turned back to his plate. "A girl and a foundered horse. The mountain will keep them both. Save us the trouble of another eviction." The table laughed again, quieter this time, and the laughter followed her out into the street. She had stood in the dark by the livery door, with the cold coming through her coat, and her hands had shaken, not from fear, but from the effort of not answering. It was in the street that the old woman had found her. Alice did not know her name, and had never learned it. She was thin as a fence rail, wrapped in a shawl the color of ash, and she moved without sound. She had lived at the edge of Fox Ridge longer than anyone remembered, in a soddy behind the churchyard, and children were told not to stare at her, and did anyway. She stopped in front of Alice and looked up into her face. Her eyes were the pale of river ice. "Child," she said. Alice waited. "What they left up there was not lost," the old woman said. "It was kept. Mind which one you become." Then she turned and was gone down the alley, between the feed store and the church. And Alice had stood a long time with the words inside her, turning them, unable to fit them to any door she knew. She had not understood then. She did not understand now. She only knew the sentence had followed her up the ridge like a second rider, and that the meadow, with its sagging canvases and its knotted ropes and its small tied shoes, was the first place in 3 months where the words did not feel foolish. The mare shifted her weight. A far crow called once from the timber and did not call again. Alice lifted her head from the mare's jaw and looked at the wagons in the changing light. And the shadow of each wheel stretched long and blue across the grass toward the eastern trees, somewhere behind her in a town she had already begun to forget the shape of. A round pink man was pouring himself another cup and telling the room she would not last a week. Alice stood up. Her knees ached. She led the mare to the nearest wagon and did not yet know why. She picketed the mare in the grass at the outer edge of the half-circle where the feed was best and the ground sloped gently for drainage, and she loosened the cinch and pulled the saddle and set it upright against a wagon wheel. The mare shook herself once, a long ripple from ear to tail, and lowered her head to the grass. Alice stood with her hand on the mare's shoulder until her own breathing slowed. The sun had gone behind the western timber, and the meadow had turned the color of pewter. A thin wind moved down out of the higher country, carrying the smell of pine sap and old snow from the shaded draws. Alice unrolled her blanket in the lee of the first wagon, close enough that she could reach out and lay her palm against the spoked wheel without sitting up. She did not build a fire. She was not yet ready to bring flame into that circle. She ate the last of the biscuit and a strip of dried venison and drank from her canteen. The water tasted of the tin. She watched the light drain out of the sky by degrees, grey to violet, to a deep blue that held for a long time before the first star came. And then the stars came all at once, so many and so bright that the wagons beneath them looked less abandoned than sleeping. She lay on her back with her hat over her eyes and listened. The meadow had its own night sounds, the mare cropping, an owl somewhere in the timber hunting, a single stone shifting in the creek at the meadow's western edge, the small ticks and settlings of old wood and old canvas. As the temperature dropped and the wagons gave back the day's warmth, Alice had expected the place to feel haunted. It did not. It felt held. It felt the way her father's front room had felt in the hour after he died, when the neighbors had not yet come, and the clock on the mantel had gone on ticking, and the world had simply continued being the world. She slept, and she did not dream. She woke once before dawn to a sound she could not name, a low creak from the wagon nearest her, as though a body had shifted inside it. She lay still with her eyes open and her hand on the knife at her belt. The sound did not come again. After a while, the mare blew softly through her nostrils, the small, comfortable sound of a horse that senses nothing wrong, and Alice let her hand relax and slept again until the sky above the eastern ridge began to pale. Dawn in the high country came slowly. The stars faded one by one, and the timber turned from black to green, and the meadow filled with a thin milk-colored light before the sun cleared the ridge. Alice sat up. Her back ached from the ground. Her breath made a small white cloud in front of her face. The canvases of the 6 wagons were pearled with dew, and the tongues, resting in the grass, were dark with it. She stood, folded the blanket, and walked once around the circle in the new light. Everything was as it had been. The tin coffee pot on the driver's seat, the tied shoes, the Bible face down on the shawl. She stopped at the 2nd wagon and set her hand on the wheel and felt the wood grain under her palm, cold and slightly damp, and older than she was. The mare lifted her head from the grass and watched her, ears forward. Alice looked back at the mare, and something passed between them without shape or sound, the way it does between 2 creatures who have come a long way together on the same road. Then Alice turned and reached up to the sideboard of the 2nd wagon, and she began, at last, to look. The 2nd wagon was smaller than the first, its box narrower, its bows tighter. Alice folded back the corner of the canvas where a leather thong had been looped through a brass grommet and knotted with a hitch her father had used on grain sacks. The knot came loose under her fingers. Inside the light was the color of weak tea. A bedroll lay along one side, still rolled and tied. A carpet bag sat at its foot. On top of the carpet bag, folded once, was a man's shirt of undyed linen, the collar frayed, the cuffs mended in small, even stitches. Alice did not lift the shirt. She let her eyes travel slowly over what she could see. A whetstone in a wooden dish, a coil of new hemp rope, a candle burned down to a thumb's length in a tin holder, and hung from a hook driven into the 2nd bow. A man's felt hat, black once, gone the color of wood smoke, with a narrow band of braided horsehair around the crown. She was about to turn away when she saw the mark. It was cut into the inner face of the sideboard, where a rider on the seat would rest his back, low, no higher than her knee, when she crouched to look. Someone had scratched it there with a knife point, patient, and saw a cross. Beside the cross, 3 letters, and below the letters, a number. Alice went still. She read the letters again to be sure. Then she read the number, and her breath left her softly, like a horse blown out at the top of a climb. The letters were her father's initials. The number was the year she was born. She stayed crouched a long time. The mare at the picket tore up a clump of grass and chewed it. The small green sound, absurdly loud in Alice's ears. Her father had never spoken of the ridge. Her father had come to Fox Ridge from the east, the year Alice was born, alone with 1 horse and a saddle and no story, and had taken the creek bottom lease and kept his own counsel until the day the fever took him. Alice had asked him once when she was a girl where he had been before. He had said only that he had been somewhere he could not go back to, and had not spoken of it again. She did not touch the mark. She did not touch the shirt or the hat. She lowered the canvas back over the bow, slid the leather thong through the brass grommet, and retied the hitch exactly as she had found it. Then she stood up and walked away from the wagon, out into the middle of the meadow, and stood there with her arms at her sides, while the sun cleared the ridge, and light struck the dew on the grass, and turned it for one long minute into a field of small white fires. She did not go back to the second wagon that morning. She had learned from her father that a thing seen and not acted upon settles into a person and tells the truth in its own time. What she had seen would not leave her. It could wait an hour. Instead, she went to work. There was a great deal of work. The wagon tongues had sunk into the sod and would need to be lifted and blocked before rot took the last of them. The canvases sagged from broken bows in 3 of the 6 wagons, and would let the next rain into everything they had held dry for 20 years. The picket rope she had strung for the mare was too short for the grass the mare needed. She began with what her hands could do without her mind. She cut 2 saplings at the meadow's edge with the hatchet from her saddlebag, and trimmed them into props, and set them under the sagging tongue of the 3rd wagon, and eased the tongue up out of the sod an inch at a time. The wood, when it came free, was black underneath, but sound. She scraped the black away with the back of her knife, and let the air get at it. She moved to the 4th wagon, and did the same. The mare watched her from the picket, and each time Alice paused to straighten her back, the mare's ears came forward, as though she were being spoken to. By mid-morning, Alice was sweating through her shirt. She stopped and drank from the creek at the meadow's western edge, kneeling on flat stones, and the water tasted the way water tastes only in high places of granite and cold and nothing else. When she came back up the slope, she saw the wagons from a new angle, and saw a thing she had not seen the day before. The half-circle was not a half-circle. It was an arc drawn to leave an opening toward the east, toward the way she had come, toward the trail down. Whoever had drawn the wagons up in this meadow had left the roadside open. They had not been circling against attack. They had been waiting for someone to come back up. She sat down on a stone and looked at that opening for a long time before she rose and went back to the work. In the afternoon, she climbed into the 1st wagon, the one she had slept beside, and began to lift things out one at a time and set them in the grass in the order she found them. The flour barrel was light. She rocked it out onto the tailgate and eased it down. Weevils had been through what was inside decades ago, and what remained was a pale dust that smelled faintly of iron. The cast-iron pot she lifted down and set upright. The folded quilt she carried in both arms like a child and laid on a flat stone in the sun. The child's wooden horse she lifted last. It was carved from a single piece of pine, the mane suggested with 3 grooves, the eye a burnt dot. One of its legs had been broken and mended with a small iron pin driven crosswise, the kind of repair a father does by lantern light after a child has cried herself to sleep. Alice held the horse a long time in her palm before she set it down on the quilt. Under the crate where the horse had rested was a second thing she had not seen from outside. A wooden box, the length of her forearm, dovetailed at the corners, lidded with 2 small brass hinges and a hasp, but no lock. She did not open it. She lifted it out and set it beside the quilt in the sun, and went back for the last of the boxes. Her hands were doing what her mind had not caught up to. She was making an inventory. She was making, without deciding to, the beginnings of a record of 18 lives. By the time the sun stood over the western timber, she had emptied 2 wagons entirely and stacked their contents in orderly rows in the grass. Her back ached in a clean way now. the way it had ached at the end of hay days on the creek bottom lease. The mare had shifted her picket twice, following the grass, and each time Alice had walked over and moved the stake and rubbed the mare's forehead and gone back to work. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the meadow cooled, and Alice sat down on the tailgate of the first wagon, with the dovetailed box on her knees, and looked at it without opening it. She sat with it a long while before she lifted the hasp. The brass was green with age and stiff, and it moved under her thumb with a small dry click that seemed loud in the cooling meadow. She raised the lid an inch, then another. Inside lay a folded square of oilcloth, and inside the oilcloth a leather-bound ledger. Its cover darkened at the corners where hands had held it, and beneath the ledger a bundle of letters tied with a length of linen tape that had once been white. Alice took the ledger out first. She rested it on her knee and opened it to the first page. Names. 18 of them entered in a careful, sloping hand, with ages beside each, and the family they belonged to. 2 men in their 40s, 3 wives, 11 children. The youngest an infant of 4 months, the oldest a girl of 15. And at the bottom of the list, alone under his own line, a young man of 22 who had joined the train at the last settlement on the plains, hired on as an outrider for his passage. His initials were her father's. The year of the roster was 68. Alice turned the pages slowly. Weather, mileage, a ford crossed at the second creek, a wheel repaired by the young outrider, a prayer for a sick ox. The hand was steady and unhurried until the entry 10 days out from the meadow, and then it changed. The ink grew heavier, the letters closer together. A spring 3 miles above the meadow had been drunk from by 2 of the children. By nightfall, both were fevered. By the next morning, 3 more were down, and 1 of the wives. The word the writer used was not one Alice knew, an older word for a sickness that came from bad water, but she understood it the way she understood the tied shoes. The last entry was short. It was dated 3 days after the first fever. It said the road ahead had closed with early snow at the pass, and the road behind was a week on foot with the sick who could not sit a wagon. It said the young outrider had offered to ride down alone by the deer trail to bring back help and medicine, and that he had gone at first light with 1 horse and no saddle to spare weight. It said the rest would walk out together at dawn, carrying the children who could not walk, leaving everything that could be left. It said in a hand that had begun to shake that if God was willing, they would return within a fortnight to gather what they had set down. It was signed with a woman's name Alice did not know. Alice closed the ledger. She did not open the letters. She sat on the tailgate with the box on her knees and looked out at the 6 wagons standing in the last blue of the sky. Her father had been the outrider. Her father had ridden down alone. Her father had not come back. She understood then that he had not been able to. She did not know yet whether the others had reached the valley or fallen on the trail. But she knew that a man of 22 who had ridden out for help and found the trail behind him, empty when he turned, would carry that emptiness the rest of his life and would keep his own counsel and would take a lease on a creek-bottom pasture in a town below a ridge road. He could not ride again and would raise a daughter and say only that he had been somewhere he could not go back to. The first cold drop of rain struck the back of her hand. She looked up. The stars were gone. A wall of cloud had come over the western timber, while she sat with the ledger, and the wind that had been thin all evening was rising now out of the higher country, cold and steady, smelling of ice. Alice moved. She closed the box, wrapped it in the oilcloth from her bedroll, and set it deep inside the first wagon under the quilt. She carried the child's wooden horse in after it. She lashed the torn canvas of the first wagon down over the bows with a length of the new hemp rope from the second wagon, working by feel as the light went. The rain came harder. The mare stamped at the picket and threw her head. Alice ran to her, loosed the picket, and led her in against the lee side of the third wagon, where the tongue she had propped that morning gave a low, sheltering angle. She threw her saddle blanket over the mare's withers and tied the lead short. Then she went back for the quilts and the shirt and the felt hat from the second wagon, and every soft thing she had unpacked and stacked in the grass, and she carried them armload after armload into the covered beds and lashed the canvases down. She was on the fourth wagon working the last knot when she heard the voice. It came from the eastern opening of the ark, low and broken, calling something she could not make out through the wind. Alice froze with her hand on the rope. The voice came again, a word that might have been help. She left the knot half-tied and moved toward the sound. A man was on his knees in the grass at the edge of the meadow. He had come up the trail she had ridden, and he had fallen the last few yards. His coat was soaked through, and his hat was gone. Beside him, half held under his arm, was a boy of perhaps 7, wrapped in a wet blanket, shivering hard enough that Alice could see it from 6 paces away. Man lifted his face to her. He was not old. His lip was split, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had walked past the end of what he had. "My wife," he said, "down the trail, leg broke on the shale." Alice did not answer. She put her arm under the boy and lifted him against her chest, and with her free hand, she caught the man under the elbow and got him to his feet. She walked them both to the third wagon, where the mare stood in the lee, and she set the boy inside on the folded quilt and put the felt hat on his wet head, because it was the driest thing she had. And she turned to the man and said, "How far?" "A mile," he said, "maybe less." Alice looked once at the wagons, at the box under the quilt in the first, at the mare with the rain running off her flanks, at the boy shivering under the black hat. She had known when she opened the ledger what she had become responsible for. She knew now what the meadow was asking of her tonight. "Stay with the boy," she said. She pulled the cinch tight on the mare and swung up bareback with the lead rope in her hand and rode out into the rain the way she had come. Alice found the woman a half-mile down where the shale broke away from the road in a long, pale scar. She lay in the wet needles with her leg turned wrong at the knee, and her hand closed around a broken pine root, as if the root had reached up to hold her. Alice knelt in the mud and spoke her name into the rain, though she did not know it, and the woman opened her eyes. Alice cut a straight branch with her knife and bound the leg with strips torn from her own shirt, and lifted the woman across the mare's withers with a strength she did not know she had. And she walked the mare back up the trail in the dark, with the rein steady on her hat and the woman's hand fisted in the mare's mane. At the meadow, she carried the woman into the third wagon and laid her beside the boy on the folded quilt. And the man wept once without sound, and then held his family, and did not let go. The storm broke before dawn. Alice built the first fire the meadow had seen in 20 years, small and sheltered under the tailgate of the third wagon, and boiled water in the tin coffee pot from the driver's seat. She fed the boy warm water with a strip of dried venison softened in it. She splinted the woman's leg properly with 2 lengths of the new hemp rope and 2 pieces of a broken bow. She did not sleep. When the sun cleared the ridge, the timber steamed, and the mare stood at the picket with her head low and her flanks quiet. And the man came and stood beside Alice at the fire and said his name was Bennett Shaw, and that he had brought his family up from the South Fork, looking for a shorter way to the valley. Alice said only, "You found the meadow." They came down the trail together 3 days later. The woman lashed into a travois Alice built from wagon slats and canvas. The boy riding on the mare in front of Alice with the black felt hat over his eyes against the sun. They reached Fox Ridge at mid-morning. The town came out into the street to watch them pass. The drover was there, and the woman with flour on her sleeves and behind them at the plank hotel door. The round pink man in his waistcoat, still pink, but no longer laughing. Alice did not look at him. She rode to the doctor's porch and lifted the boy down. Word went up the street before nightfall. Bennett Shaw told it at the long table, plainly, without ornament, of a girl who had ridden a mile in the dark for a stranger's wife and given her own shirt for a splint. A clerk from the land office came to the livery loft the next morning, with the ledger open in his hands. He was a slight man, with ink on his cuffs, and he read the roster twice and closed the book gently and said, "These names have been carried on the missing list for 20 years. The record you brought down closes it." He looked at Alice for a long moment. "Your father is on this page." Alice said, "I know." The clerk nodded once and did not press her. Outsiders began to arrive. A grown son of one of the wives came from 3 days east and stood in the livery yard with his hat in his hand. A grandchild of one of the men rode up from the plains. Each one Alice met at the hotel and led up the ridge road herself on the mare, and each one she brought to the wagon that had been theirs and left them to it. The town watched her go and watched her come back. The laughter had gone out of the street. The round pink man came to the hotel porch one evening as Alice was tying the mare and said, without meeting her eyes, "The lease on the creek bottom. It was never rightly closed." He held out a folded paper. Alice took it. She did not thank him. She did not need to. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped back inside, and the porch was quiet, and the woman with flour on her sleeves brought Alice a cup of coffee without a word. By the end of summer, Alice had ridden the ridge road 11 times. The meadow had been walked by 14 people who had waited 20 years to walk it. She had given the child's wooden horse to a woman of 40, who had been the infant of 4 months on the roster, and the woman had held it against her chest and cried without sound the way Bennett Shaw had cried in the wagon in the rain. Alice kept the ledger and the letters she had never opened in the dovetailed box on the mantel of the small cabin she had built on the creek bottom lease next to the clock her father had wound every night of her life. The mare grazed the pasture below the window. She was older now and slower, and she did not go up the ridge road any more, and Alice did not ask her to. On an evening in late September, Alice walked up alone from the creek to the ridge on foot and stood in the meadow at golden hour. The grass was tall and gone to seed. 5 of the 6 wagons stood empty now. Canvases mended, tongues blocked and dry. The 6th she had left as she found it at the request of a family that meant to come one last time in the spring. The old woman from behind the churchyard, whose name Alice had learned at last, was Miriam, stood at the edge of the timber where Alice had asked her to wait, wrapped in her ash-coloured shawl. Alice looked out across the arc left open toward the east, toward the trail down, and she understood the whole shape of the thing. What they had left up there had been kept. She had not become the one the round pink man wanted her to become. She had become the one who came back up. Miriam stepped out of the timber and came to stand beside her. And after a while she said, "What have you made of it, girl?" Alice watched the light run gold along the grass and settle on the far wagon wheels. "Not a claim," she said, "a promise kept. Thank you for staying with Alice to the end of the ridge road, for walking with a young woman who refused to leave the dismissed behind and found her own inheritance in the keeping of it. If this story warmed you, leave a like. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next quiet frontier tale finds you when the lantern is next lit.